The whispers cascaded through the packed courtroom like venomous serpents, slithering between the wooden benches and coiling around Eleanor Blackwood's slender throat as she stood in the defendant's box. "Thief," they called her. "Crown jewel thief," they spat with contempt. These aristocrats who had never spared her a second glance when she served silently in their shadows as a lady's companion. The Grand Bailey Courthouse of London had never witnessed such a spectacle. A mere lady's companion, accused of stealing the priceless Pembroke sapphires, royal heirlooms bestowed upon the family by Queen Victoria herself. Eleanor's delicate fingers trembled against the rough wooden railing as she maintained her posture, chin lifted despite the weight of accusation crushing down upon her shoulders. The severity of her situation was reflected in the cold, calculating eyes of Magistrate Bennet, whose reputation for harsh sentences against those who dared disrupt the sacred order of aristocratic society preceded him like a death knell. Lady Victoria Pembroke sat in the front row, her porcelain features arranged in a mask of righteous indignation, occasionally dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief for theatrical effect. The sapphires had vanished during her grandiose midsummer ball, and she had wasted no time pointing her manicured finger at Eleanor, the quiet, bookish companion who had always seemed too observant, too intelligent for her station. What made the accusation so devastating was not merely the potential punishment, transportation to the colonies or worse, but that Eleanor refused to provide any alibi for her whereabouts during the critical hours when the jewels disappeared. The crowd murmured that only guilt could explain such stubborn silence, but deep within her heart, Eleanor knew that her silence protected something far more valuable than her own freedom or reputation. The truth that Eleanor guarded so fiercely lay in the memories of that fateful night, not of jewel theft but of hushed footsteps down the manor's east corridor, a surreptitious knock on a hidden door, and the unexpected vulnerability in the steel-grey eyes of the most formidable man in England. The Duke of Thornfield, Alexander Harrington, had summoned her that night, not for any impropriety as the gossips might have relished imagining, but because Eleanor alone possessed the knowledge that might bring him peace regarding his sister's mysterious death. Eleanor had spent hours in his private study, surrounded by ancient books and the scent of brandy, helping him decipher his sister's final diary entries that contained secrets that could destroy more than one noble family if revealed. They had sworn to protect each other's involvement, a vow Eleanor would not break even to save herself. "I'm so happy you're here with me today for this tale of secrets, sacrifice and vindication." Before we continue deeper into Eleanor's perilous situation, please consider subscribing and leaving a like to support more historical stories that transport you to another time. Now, let us return to the tense courtroom where Eleanor's fate hangs in the balance. The circumstances that had led Eleanor to this precarious position stretched back much further than that summer evening. Born to a clergyman's family of modest means but impeccable education, Eleanor had been thrust into service after her father's death left the family destitute. Her quick mind and natural grace had secured her a position in the Pembroke household, where she was tolerated rather than welcomed by Lady Victoria, who resented the younger woman's natural beauty and the admiring glances it drew from her brother, Lord Richard. What began as petty jealousy had festered into outright hostility when Richard began seeking Eleanor's company at every opportunity, drawn to her insightful observations and gentle wit. Victoria had been searching for any opportunity to remove this perceived threat to her family's dignity, and the missing sapphires provided the perfect weapon. As the prosecution presented its case with theatrical flourish, depicting Eleanor as an ungrateful snake who had taken advantage of her employer's trust, her thoughts drifted to the Duke of Thornfield. Alexander Harrington was known throughout England as a man of ice and iron. Widowed young, he had transformed his grief into ruthless business acumen, amassing a fortune that rivaled the crown's while maintaining a frigid distance from society's attempts to entangle him in remarriage. Few knew of the warmth that occasionally flickered behind his steely gaze, the devotion he had harbored for his younger sister Catherine before consumption claimed her life the previous winter. Even fewer would believe that this intimidating figure had shown Eleanor genuine respect during their clandestine meeting, valuing her intellect and insights in a way no one in her life ever had. Now as she faced ruin, she wondered if he even knew of her predicament, or if she had already been forgotten, a momentary tool for his purposes, now discarded as he moved on with his privileged life. 6 months before the fateful trial, Eleanor had first encountered the Duke of Thornfield at one of Lady Victoria's garden parties. While serving tea to the distinguished guests, Eleanor had overheard him discussing a rare medieval text that contained references to ancient healing practices, the very subject her father had researched extensively before his death. When she accidentally revealed her knowledge by correcting a minor historical detail in the Duke's conversation, the entire gathering had fallen silent in horrified embarrassment. Rather than displaying outrage at her presumption, the Duke had fixed his penetrating gaze upon her, asking several pointed questions that Eleanor answered with precision and depth that belied her station. Lady Victoria had punished her severely for the transgression, confining her to quarters for a week, but the brief interaction had planted a seed of mutual respect that would later bloom into something neither could have anticipated. The Duke had recognized something in Eleanor that others missed, a keen intellect trapped within the rigid boundaries of class and gender. The connection between Eleanor and Alexander might have ended there, relegated to a curious memory, had fate not intervened through tragedy. The Duke's beloved sister Catherine had been a regular visitor to the Pembroke estate during her final months, often accompanied by her brother when her strength failed. During these visits, Catherine had formed an unlikely friendship with Eleanor, who read to her when her eyes grew too weak and listened to her increasingly confused ramblings without judgment. What Eleanor didn't reveal to anyone was that Catherine had entrusted her with a small leather diary in the week before her death, extracting a promise that Eleanor would deliver it to her brother if anything unexpected should happen. The young woman had died peacefully in her sleep shortly thereafter, but Eleanor had detected something unsettling in the timing and circumstances, suspicions that grew stronger as she eventually broke her promise and examined the diary's cryptic contents, finding references to slow poison and his treachery. The courtroom's stuffy air grew thicker as the prosecution called witness after witness, servants and party guests who testified to Eleanor's opportunity and apparent motive. Lord Richard Pembroke shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his handsome face contorted with conflicting emotions, as he watched the woman he had grown to admire being systematically destroyed before his eyes. He had offered to speak in her defense, to attest to her character, but Eleanor had refused his assistance through her court-appointed solicitor, knowing that any public support from him would only fuel his sister's vindictive rage. Richard's confused hurt was palpable across the courtroom, another weight upon Eleanor's already burdened conscience. She had rebuffed his romantic overtures gently but firmly, knowing that no good could come of a match so disparate in station, yet she had valued his friendship and intellectual companionship in the lonely existence of service. Meanwhile, across London in his imposing Mayfair mansion, Alexander Harrington stood at his study window, a telegram crumpled in his fist as rage and disbelief battled within him. He had only just learned of Eleanor's arrest and trial, the news deliberately kept from him during a prolonged business journey to Scotland. The realization that she faced ruin and imprisonment because of her loyalty to him, her unwillingness to reveal their meeting that would provide her perfect alibi, struck him with the force of physical pain. The Duke recognized the manipulation at work, the convenient timing of this accusation while he was away, unable to intervene. In that moment of clarity, Alexander understood that Eleanor Blackwood had awakened something within him he had thought permanently extinguished after his wife's betrayal and death, a capacity for genuine feeling, for connection beyond mere duty or advantage. The woman who had helped him uncover the truth about his sister's suspicious death now faced destruction for her silence, and he would not allow it. The massive clock in the courthouse struck 3, signaling the afternoon session's commencement as Eleanor's solicitor concluded his feeble defense, hampered by his client's refusal to provide any explanation for her whereabouts. Magistrate Bennet adjusted his spectacles with an air of impatient finality, preparing to deliver the verdict that everyone in the crowded room already anticipated. Outside, the sound of carriage wheels skidding to an abrupt halt on the cobblestones penetrated the heavy courthouse doors, followed by the commotion of a commanding voice overriding the protests of court officers. As the massive doors swung open with thunderous force, every head in the gallery turned in unison, and a collective gasp rippled through the assembly as the tall, imposing figure of the Duke of Thornfield strode down the centre aisle, his greatcoat billowing behind him like the wings of an avenging angel. Time seemed to suspend itself as Alexander Harrington's commanding presence filled the courtroom, his aristocratic features set in lines of cold determination that made even the magistrate straighten in his chair. Eleanor's heart performed a painful somersault in her chest, a mixture of relief and terror flooding her veins as she realized what his appearance meant. The Duke was breaking their pact of secrecy, placing himself at the center of a scandal that could expose the investigation they had conducted together, an investigation that had led them to suspect a prominent member of Parliament of poisoning Catherine for her substantial inheritance. The spectators' whispers crescendoed into an audible buzz as the Duke approached the bench with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything in his life, bowing with precise formality to the magistrate before turning to face the crowd. His steel-grey eyes swept the assembly with contempt before settling on Eleanor, and in that fleeting moment something passed between them that no one else could perceive, a silent communication that made her knees weak with its intensity and unmistakable meaning. "Your Honor," the Duke announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the room without effort, "I must interrupt these proceedings with evidence that will conclusively prove Miss Blackwood's innocence." The courtroom erupted into chaos, with Lady Victoria half rising from her seat in alarm and Lord Richard's expression transforming from despondency to bewilderment. Magistrate Bennet pounded his gavel repeatedly, demanding order from the shocked assembly, who could scarcely believe that the kingdom's most powerful duke would involve himself in the trial of a mere lady's companion. Eleanor watched with a strange sense of detachment, as though observing a theatrical performance rather than the unfolding of her own fate. She had maintained her silence to protect Alexander from scandal, to shield his investigation into his sister's death, yet here he stood, willingly placing himself at the center of society's most voracious gossip mill to save her. The realization that he valued her welfare above his carefully guarded privacy struck her with the force of a physical blow. Alexander proceeded to deliver his testimony with meticulous precision, explaining how Eleanor had been in his private study from 9 in the evening until well past midnight on the night of the supposed theft, assisting him with research related to his late sister's literary collection. He produced his butler and coachman as witnesses who could corroborate her arrival and departure times that made it physically impossible for her to have been anywhere near the Pembroke sapphires when they disappeared. With each word, Eleanor watched Lady Victoria's face contort with increasing fury, her carefully orchestrated revenge crumbling before her eyes. The magistrate listened with growing discomfort, acutely aware that he faced a delicate situation: either accept the word of England's most powerful duke or side with the accusation of a lesser noble family. The balance of power in that equation was evident to everyone present, and Eleanor could already sense the direction in which the scales of justice were tipping, not because of truth, but because of Alexander's enormous social influence. What Alexander carefully omitted from his testimony was the true nature of their meeting. The hours spent poring over Catherine's diary, deciphering her coded references to her suspicions that her physician, Lord Edmund Whitley, had been slowly poisoning her at the behest of her husband's cousin, who stood to inherit her fortune upon her death. He made no mention of the evidence they had compiled, the samples of medications they had secured for testing, or their plans to confront Lord Whitley once they had irrefutable proof. Instead, he crafted a plausible alternative explanation that protected their secrets while providing Eleanor with an unassailable alibi. The artful construction of his testimony reminded Eleanor why the Duke was considered such a formidable opponent in business and politics. His mind worked with strategic precision that anticipated and countered every potential challenge. As he spoke, his gaze occasionally returned to Eleanor, and she understood that he was silently asking for her trust and cooperation in this new narrative they would share. Lady Victoria, sensing the shifting sentiment in the courtroom, made a desperate final attempt to salvage her accusation by suggesting impropriety between Eleanor and the Duke, insinuations that caused gasps and titillated murmurs throughout the gallery. The color drained from Eleanor's face at the implication, the one thing she had feared more than prison itself, becoming the center of a scandal that would tarnish the Duke's reputation. But Alexander's response was swift and devastating, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that commanded absolute attention as he addressed Victoria directly. "Lady Pembroke," he stated with glacial precision, "your desperation betrays the truth of this matter. Miss Blackwood has been my sister's research assistant for her historical studies for over a year, a fact easily verified by my household staff and numerous scholars who corresponded with them. Your baseless accusations against a woman of impeccable character reflect not on Miss Blackwood but on your own lack of moral discernment. To stand is the ruthless efficiency with which he dismantled Victoria's character, while elevating Eleanor's status, sent ripples of shocked appreciation through the courtroom, and Eleanor felt the first cautious bloom of hope unfurling in her chest as she watched her accuser's face flame with humiliation. The magistrate, eager to extricate himself from the increasingly uncomfortable situation, declared a brief recess to consider the new evidence. Eleanor was escorted to a small antechamber where she paced the confined space, her mind racing to process the dramatic turn of events. She had resigned herself to ruin, had accepted the sacrifices necessary to protect the investigation that might bring justice to Catherine and prevent other vulnerable women from falling victim to similar schemes. Never had she imagined that Alexander would jeopardize everything by coming forward, creating an entirely new narrative that positioned her as his sister's legitimate employee rather than a clandestine ally. The fabrication was clever, close enough to the truth to be defendable while obscuring their actual activities, but it created a new complication. If she were acquitted based on this testimony, Eleanor would be inextricably linked to the Duke in the public imagination, subject to continued scrutiny that might eventually expose their true purpose. The thought both terrified and, to her confusion, elicited a flutter of something else entirely in her chest, a sensation she dared not examine too closely. When the court reconvened 30 minutes later, the tension in the room was palpable as Magistrate Bennet delivered his ruling. In light of the testimony provided by His Grace, the Duke of Thornfield, and the corroborating evidence from his household staff, this court finds that Miss Eleanor Blackwood could not have been present at Pembroke Manor during the time of the theft. The charges against her are therefore dismissed. A collective exhalation swept through the gallery, followed immediately by an explosion of conversation as the spectators processed this unexpected conclusion. Eleanor stood perfectly still, the relief washing over her in waves that threatened to dissolve her carefully maintained composure. Her gaze sought Alexander across the crowded room, finding him already watching her with an intensity that created a private silence between them amid the cacophony. In that moment of connection, something fundamental shifted in their relationship. No longer merely conspirators united by a common purpose, but two people who had risked everything to protect each other, creating a bond that transcended the rigid boundaries of their disparate social positions. Lady Victoria's reaction to the dismissal was swift and venomous. Rising from her seat with theatrical indignation, she loudly declared that the sapphires had mysteriously reappeared in her jewelry case that very morning, suggesting that the thief had returned them upon hearing of the Duke's involvement. The transparent attempt to save face fooled no one, particularly as several witnesses exchanged knowing glances that suggested the jewels had never truly been missing. Lord Richard Pembroke's expression as he watched his sister's desperate maneuvering revealed a man confronting uncomfortable truths about his family for perhaps the first time. His gaze shifted to Eleanor with a complexity of emotion, admiration, apology, and a dawning realization that the quiet companion he had pursued so persistently was connected to a world and to people far beyond what he had imagined. As the court adjourned amid continuing commotion, Richard approached his sister and spoke briefly but firmly to her, his usual affable expression replaced by one of grim determination before he escorted her from the courthouse, neither of them acknowledging Eleanor as they passed. Outside the courtroom, Eleanor found herself surrounded by a small protective circle formed by the Duke's servants, who efficiently guided her through the crowd of curious onlookers and sensation-seeking journalists to where his carriage waited at the curb. The unexpected consideration of this arrangement, Alexander had anticipated the aftermath and prepared accordingly, brought a lump to her throat. For so long she had navigated the world alone, making her own difficult choices and bearing their consequences without support. The novel experience of being protected, of having someone powerful enough to shield her from the worst effects of society's judgment, was almost overwhelming in its unfamiliarity. As she was assisted into the luxurious conveyance, Eleanor glimpsed Alexander speaking intently with her solicitor, pressing something into the man's hand before striding toward the carriage. She had only a moment to compose herself before he joined her in the confined space, his large frame making the carriage seem suddenly much smaller as he took the seat opposite her. The door closed with a definitive click, sealing them into a private world as the horses moved forward, leaving behind the courthouse and, Eleanor fervently hoped, the worst day of her life. The silence between them stretched for several long moments as the carriage wound through London's busy streets. Eleanor's hands twisted nervously in her lap, her mind struggling to form appropriate words of gratitude for what he had done. Before she could speak, Alexander leaned forward, his usually impassive face animated with an emotion she had never before witnessed in him. "I must apologize for the liberty I took in constructing our association as I did," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual commanding resonance, and instead carrying a note of genuine concern. "It was the most effective strategy I could devise on short notice to ensure your immediate freedom, but I recognize that I have placed you in a difficult position socially. The story of your employment with Catherine provides a respectable explanation for our acquaintance, but it will not entirely shield you from gossip." The consideration in his words, his awareness of the precarious position of an unmarried woman of modest means in their society, revealed a depth of understanding that few men of his station possessed. Eleanor found herself studying his face with new appreciation, noting the fatigue etched around his eyes and the slight dishevelment of his usually immaculate appearance that spoke of his haste to reach her in time. For a man known for his calculated precision in all things, these small signs of disruption represented a significant departure, one that she suddenly realized had been undertaken entirely for her sake. "I never intended for this to happen," Eleanor finally replied, her voice barely above a whisper as the carriage turned onto a quieter street. "When I was arrested, I assumed you would never know, that I would face whatever punishment came rather than expose our investigation. I could not bear the thought of Catherine's death going unpunished because I had failed to protect your confidence." Her words hung between them, simple but profound in their implication. She had been prepared to sacrifice everything, her freedom, her reputation, her future, not merely out of loyalty to their pact, but out of a deeper concern for justice that aligned perfectly with his own obsession. Alexander's expression shifted subtly as he absorbed this revelation, the rigid control he typically maintained over his features softening almost imperceptibly. Eleanor watched the transformation with fascination, having never before witnessed this unguarded aspect of the formidable Duke who had occupied so many of her thoughts over recent months. "You would have gone to prison to protect our secret," he said, the statement carrying a weight of realization that seemed to surprise even him. He leaned forward, closing some of the distance between them, his gaze searching her face with an intensity that made Eleanor's breath catch. "Just as I could not allow you to suffer for our shared purpose. It seems we have reached an unexpected impasse of mutual protection, Miss Blackwood." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, transforming his austere features with a warmth that Eleanor had glimpsed only in rare, unguarded moments during their clandestine meetings. The carriage swayed gently around a corner, momentarily throwing them slightly off balance, causing Alexander's knee to brush against hers. The fleeting contact sent a jolt of awareness through Eleanor that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with the increasingly complex emotions this man evoked in her, emotions she had carefully avoided examining too closely during their collaboration. Alexander straightened, clearing his throat as he returned to the practical matters at hand. "I have arranged temporary accommodations for you at my sister's former residence in Mayfair. The house has been maintained since her passing, with a skeleton staff who can be trusted implicitly. You will be safe there while we determine our next steps." His consideration for her predicament touched Eleanor deeply. With her name cleared, but her position at the Pembroke household obviously untenable, she had been facing the daunting prospect of finding new employment while carrying the lingering taint of scandal. The Duke had anticipated this dilemma and solved it with characteristic efficiency, though the solution presented its own complications. The story I provided in court, that you were Catherine's research assistant, can be substantiated retroactively. I have already instructed my solicitor to prepare documentation and compensation reflecting such an arrangement dating back to before her death. This will provide you with both financial security and a respectable explanation for your continuing presence at Catherine's house as you catalogue her research collection. What Alexander did not say, what hovered unspoken in the space between them, was that this arrangement would also facilitate the continuation of their investigation. With Eleanor installed in Catherine's house, they could meet without arousing suspicion, ostensibly to manage Catherine's scholarly legacy, while actually pursuing evidence against Lord Whitley and his mysterious patron. The elegant solution addressed multiple problems simultaneously, yet as Eleanor considered it, she found herself wondering about Alexander's motivations. Was this merely a practical arrangement to serve their mutual goal of justice for Catherine, or was there something more personal, driving his extraordinary efforts on her behalf? The question formed in her mind but remained unvoiced, partly from uncertainty, and partly from a strange fear that examining his motives too closely might shatter the delicate connection that had formed between them, a connection that transcended their initial alliance of convenience and had begun to take on qualities that Eleanor scarcely dared acknowledge even to herself. The carriage slowed as they approached a handsome townhouse set slightly back from the street, its elegant facade speaking of refined taste rather than ostentatious wealth. "We have arrived," Alexander announced unnecessarily, his gaze still fixed on Eleanor's face with that unsettling intensity. Catherine loved this house. She called it her sanctuary from society's endless demands. Something in his voice as he mentioned his sister, a tenderness that contrasted sharply with his public persona, made Eleanor's heart ache with a complex mixture of emotions. She had never met Catherine in life, yet through her diary and Alexander's rare, unguarded reminiscences, she had developed a profound connection to this woman whose quest for truth had ultimately cost her life. As the carriage door opened, and Alexander descended to offer her his hand, Eleanor felt as though she was stepping not just into Catherine's former home, but into a new chapter of her own life, one inextricably bound to the man whose warm grip now steadied her descent to the pavement. The touch lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary, and in that brief suspension of time, a wordless understanding passed between them. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Catherine's home embraced Eleanor with unexpected warmth, its elegant rooms filled with personal touches that spoke of a vibrant, intellectual woman, shelves overflowing with books on every conceivable subject, a magnificent piano with sheet music still open as if awaiting its owner's return, walls adorned with botanical sketches and scientific illustrations rather than the usual ancestral portraits. The housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, a dignified woman with kind eyes and an air of quiet competence, welcomed Eleanor without a hint of curiosity or judgment, treating her arrival as if it had been long expected. Alexander moved through the space with a familiarity tinged with melancholy, his hand occasionally brushing objects his sister had touched, his expression momentarily unguarded in these private moments of remembrance. Eleanor observed him silently, understanding with growing clarity that beneath his formidable public persona lay a man devastated by loss and driven by a fierce determination to honor his sister's memory through justice. This glimpse of vulnerability in someone so powerful and controlled stirred something profound within her, a recognition that perhaps they were not so different after all, both intimately acquainted with grief and the struggle to forge meaning from its ashes. Over the following days, Eleanor settled into a strange new routine, dividing her time between genuinely cataloguing Catherine's extensive collection of books and research materials, a task she found genuinely fascinating, and continuing their investigation into Lord Whitley's suspicious activities. Alexander visited daily, arriving with meticulous discretion, despite the fact that their association now had a plausible public explanation. These visits began with formal discussions of their progress, reviewing evidence and planning next steps with the focused precision of collaborators. but increasingly gave way to more personal conversations as the hours stretched into evening. Seated in Catherine's library, sharing simple meals brought by Mrs. Winters, they found themselves venturing beyond the boundaries of their shared mission, exchanging stories of their vastly different childhoods, discovering unexpected points of connection in their love of literature and history, their mutual discomfort with society's shallow performances, their belief in justice beyond the limitations of class and privilege. In these unguarded moments, Eleanor began to see Alexander not as the untouchable Duke of Thornfield, but as a man of profound complexity, brilliant and driven, certainly, but also thoughtful, occasionally wryly humorous, and capable of a depth of feeling that society would never suspect behind his cold exterior. What neither acknowledged openly was the subtle shift occurring between them with each passing day, how Alexander's arrival was preceded by an increasingly thorough attention to her appearance, how his departures grew more reluctant, how their hands occasionally brushed while examining documents, creating moments of electric awareness that lingered in the air between them. Eleanor tried to dismiss these sensations as inappropriate distractions from their purpose, reminded herself of the vast social gulf that separated them, yet found herself increasingly unable to deny the truth that lurked beneath her logical objections. Something was blooming between them that defied conventional categorization, not merely attraction or respect or shared purpose, but a complex interweaving of all these elements into something neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed. Alexander, too, seemed caught in this undefined transition, his normally impeccable self-control occasionally slipping to reveal glimpses of internal conflict, particularly when conversation veered toward the future and what would happen once their investigation concluded. The social implications of their arrangement could not be ignored forever, however, and after a fortnight of peaceful seclusion, reality intruded in the form of an invitation that arrived for Alexander, an elaborate card requesting his presence at Lady Montgomery's annual midsummer ball, the most significant social event of the season. Eleanor noticed his frown as he read it during their afternoon meeting, the slight tightening of his jaw that signaled displeasure. "I had hoped to avoid these obligations until our matter was concluded," he explained, setting the invitation aside with evident distaste, "but my continued absence would invite speculation that might draw unwanted attention to our activities." The practical truth of his statement was undeniable. The Duke of Thornfield could not withdraw entirely from society without causing comment, yet Eleanor felt an unexpected pang at the thought of Alexander returning to that glittering world that had no place for her. She busied herself with the document they had been reviewing, hoping her momentary dismay had not shown on her face, when Alexander's next words caused her head to snap up in surprise. "I believe it would be advantageous if you were to accompany me to this event, Miss Blackwood." The implications of Alexander's suggestion hung in the air between them, momentous and potentially transformative. His reasoning, when he elaborated, was characteristically logical. Attending together would reinforce the narrative of her position as his sister's research assistant, preventing any revival of malicious gossip from the trial, while simultaneously providing an opportunity to observe Lord Whitley in a social setting where he might be less guarded. Yet beneath this practical explanation, Eleanor sensed something more personal motivating the invitation, something reflected in the unusual intensity of Alexander's gaze as he awaited her response. The prospect of entering society on the arm of the Duke of Thornfield, of facing the stares and whispers of the very people who had so recently condemned her, filled Eleanor with trepidation. Yet she also recognized the strategic value of the plan, and perhaps more significantly, found herself unwilling to refuse any opportunity to remain in Alexander's company, regardless of the circumstances. Drawing on reserves of courage she had not known she possessed, Eleanor gave a single decisive nod of acceptance, unaware that this simple gesture was setting in motion events that would irrevocably alter both their lives in ways neither could possibly anticipate. The night of Lady Montgomery's ball arrived with a flurry of preparation that left Eleanor breathless with anxiety and anticipation. Alexander had arranged for the finest modiste in London to visit Catherine's home, bringing with her an array of exquisite fabrics and designs that Eleanor would never have dreamed of wearing in her former position. The gown they created was a masterpiece of understated elegance, deep sapphire blue silk that complemented her fair complexion and brought out the unusual violet blue of her eyes, with subtle silver embroidery at the bodice and hem that caught the light with every movement. Mrs. Winters had arranged for a skilled lady's maid to dress Eleanor's chestnut hair in an elegant style that emphasized its natural waves, adorned with a simple silver hairpin that had belonged to Catherine, a touch that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes when the housekeeper presented it. As she stood before the mirror in Catherine's bedchamber, barely recognizing the refined young woman who gazed back at her, Eleanor felt a complex mixture of emotions: gratitude for Alexander's generosity, apprehension about the evening ahead, and beneath it all a tremulous excitement at the prospect of entering Alexander's world, if only for one night. The transformation was not merely external. Something fundamental had shifted within her during these weeks at Catherine's house, a growing confidence and sense of purpose that stemmed from being valued for her mind and character rather than dismissed for her station. Alexander's arrival to escort her to the ball brought a moment of breathtaking mutual recognition that neither was entirely prepared for. He stood in the entrance hall, resplendent in formal evening attire that emphasized his impressive height and powerful build, his dark hair brushed back from his forehead, his steel-grey eyes widening almost imperceptibly as Eleanor descended the stairs. The customary mask of ducal composure slipped for just an instant, revealing genuine admiration that sent a flush of warmth to Eleanor's cheeks. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying a note she had never heard before, "you do honor to my sister's memory tonight." The simple statement, laden with meaning that transcended conventional compliments, touched Eleanor more deeply than any flowery praise could have. As he offered his arm to escort her to his waiting carriage, she felt the subtle tremor in his normally steady hand, a tiny betrayal of emotion that gave her the courage to meet his gaze directly. What passed between them in that silent exchange remained unspoken, yet both felt its significance, a tacit acknowledgement that whatever story they presented to society that evening, a deeper truth was evolving between them that had nothing to do with their carefully constructed narrative. The Montgomery mansion blazed with light as they approached, hundreds of candles illuminating the grandest ballroom in London, where the elite of society had gathered in all their finery. Eleanor felt her courage faltering as the carriage drew to a halt, the memory of her last public appearance standing in the defendant's box at her trial suddenly overwhelming her composure. Alexander seemed to sense her distress, for he paused before descending, turning to face her in the intimate confines of the carriage. "Remember why we are here," he said quietly, his voice steady and reassuring. "You have nothing to fear or be ashamed of. These people who would judge you are not worthy to tie your shoe." The unexpected fierceness of this statement, coming from a man who embodied the very aristocracy he was now dismissing, startled Eleanor into a smile. Alexander's expression softened in response, and he reached out to adjust a small fold in her shawl with a gentleness that belied his powerful frame. "Besides," he added with the ghost of a smile that transformed his austere features, "you will have the protection of the most disagreeable man in England, which should deter even the most determined gossips." Their entrance into the ballroom created exactly the sensation Alexander had anticipated, a ripple of shock followed by a wave of hushed whispers that spread through the crowded space like wildfire. Lady Montgomery herself, a formidable dowager whose social influence was unmatched in London, recovered quickly from her surprise to greet them with impeccable if somewhat frosty politeness. Eleanor stood at Alexander's side, drawing on every ounce of the quiet dignity that had sustained her through her trial, her chin lifted and her gaze steady, despite the curious and often hostile stares directed her way. Alexander's hand at her elbow provided silent support as he guided her through the initial greetings, with a select few of his acquaintances, individuals whose reactions ranged from poorly disguised shock to cautious acceptance. Through it all, Alexander maintained a protective presence beside her, his usual aloofness now serving as a shield that deflected the worst of society's judgment. What Eleanor noticed with growing amazement was how differently Alexander was perceived in this setting. Feared rather than respected, his cold courtesy interpreted as arrogance rather than the careful reserve she had come to recognize as his defense against a world that had given him little reason to trust in genuine connection. They had been at the ball for perhaps an hour, navigating the delicate social battlefield with cautious success, when Eleanor first spotted Lord Whitley across the room. The physician was deep in conversation with a portly gentleman Eleanor recognized as Lord Pembroke, Victoria's father, their heads bent together in what appeared to be an intense discussion. Alexander noticed the direction of her gaze and subtly steered them toward a position where they could better observe without being obvious in their scrutiny. "Whitley has been in financial difficulties for some time," Alexander murmured, his lips barely moving as he pretended to show Eleanor a particular architectural feature of the ballroom. "Yet recently he has made several significant purchases, including a new townhouse in Belgravia. The timing coincides precisely with my sister's declining health." Eleanor nodded almost imperceptibly, filing away this new information as they continued their careful observation. What happened next occurred with such sudden drama that it seemed orchestrated for maximum effect. Lady Victoria Pembroke entered their line of sight, spotted Eleanor on Alexander's arm, and promptly dropped her champagne glass in theatrical shock, the shattering crystal drawing every eye in the vicinity to the tableau they created. Victoria's voice, deliberately pitched to Carrie, cut through the momentary silence. "I see the crown jewel thief has found protection in high places. One wonders what services she provides to warrant such unprecedented favor." The silence that followed Victoria's venomous accusation seemed to stretch into infinity, the assembled aristocracy collectively holding their breath in anticipation of the scandal unfolding before them. Eleanor felt her face flush with humiliation, the confidence she had carefully cultivated over recent weeks, threatening to crumble beneath this public assault. But before she could react, she felt Alexander's hand move from her elbow to the small of her back, the pressure firm and steadying, a silent communication of support more eloquent than words. When he spoke, his voice carried throughout the suddenly hushed ballroom, the quiet tone somehow more commanding than if he had shouted. "Lady Pembroke," Alexander began, his words precise and measured, "your continued fixation on Miss Blackwood after her complete exoneration suggests a concerning instability of character that might benefit from medical attention." The clinical assessment, delivered with the Duke's characteristic icy precision, caused several onlookers to gasp at its ruthless effectiveness. Victoria's face contorted with rage, but Alexander continued before she could respond, his tone shifting to something harder and more dangerous as he stepped slightly forward, subtly positioning himself between Eleanor and her accuser. "However, should you persist in spreading malicious falsehoods about Miss Blackwood, you will find yourself facing not only a ruinous suit for slander, but the permanent withdrawal of the Thornfield family's considerable business interests from any enterprise connected to your father. I trust I have made myself perfectly clear." The transformation of the social atmosphere was immediate and palpable. The assembled nobility, reassessing the situation with the lightning calculation of those whose existence depended on aligning themselves with power. Lady Victoria, her complexion alternating between deathly pale and mottled red, found herself suddenly standing alone, as those who had been eager to join in her persecution moments before discreetly created distance between themselves and the target of the Duke's displeasure. Lord Pembroke materialized at his daughter's side, his florid face creased with alarm as he grasped the implications of Alexander's threat to their family's financial interests. He offered a stammering apology, awkwardly attributing Victoria's outburst to excessive champagne and the lingering effects of the shock of the supposed theft, before firmly escorting his daughter from the immediate vicinity. Eleanor stood perfectly still throughout this exchange, outwardly composed while inwardly reeling from the magnitude of Alexander's public defense. It was one thing to clear her name legally, quite another to align himself so decisively with her in the court of social opinion, especially at potential cost to his own business connections. The significance of this choice, for it was unmistakably a choice rather than a mere reaction, was not lost on Eleanor or on the keenly observant members of society who witnessed it. The incident created a subtle but profound shift in the evening's dynamics. Those who had been openly hostile to Eleanor now maintained a careful distance, while others who recognized the decisive change in the Duke's public stance began tentative overtures of acceptance. Alexander remained at Eleanor's side, his commanding presence a shield against further direct attacks, though his attention seemed increasingly divided between his social responsibilities and covert observation of Lord Whitley, who had watched the confrontation with Victoria with particular intensity. During a brief moment when Alexander was unavoidably engaged in conversation with Lady Montgomery, Eleanor found herself approached by an elegantly dressed older woman whose sharp eyes and thoughtful expression set her apart from the more vapid socialites. "My dear," the woman said quietly, introducing herself as the Countess of Harrington, Alexander's maternal aunt, "I have not seen my nephew defend anyone so passionately since his university days. You must be quite remarkable indeed." The simple statement, delivered without judgment or insinuation, carried a weight of approval that brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes, which she quickly blinked away. The Countess noticed but pretended not to, continuing in the same gentle tone. "Catherine would have liked you very much, I think. She had little patience for pretense or cruelty and a great appreciation for quiet courage." The remainder of the evening unfolded with surprising smoothness, the initial scandal giving way to the usual rhythms of the ball as new gossip and intrigues captured society's fickle attention. Helena and Alexander maintained their careful observation of Lord Whitley, noting his interactions, and particularly his extended conversation with a severe-looking older gentleman whom Alexander identified in a whispered aside as Baron Blackwood, a distant relation to the Pembroke family with considerable political influence. As the night progressed, Eleanor became increasingly aware of a subtle change in Alexander's demeanor, a tension that had nothing to do with their surroundings and everything to do with her proximity. His hand lingered a fraction longer than necessary when helping her to a chair. His gaze sought hers with increasing frequency, and there was a warmth in his voice when addressing her that had not been present before. The transformation was so gradual that Eleanor might have dismissed it as imagination had she not caught the speculative glances of more observant members of society, particularly the Countess of Harrington, whose knowing smile suggested she recognized something in her nephew's behavior that Eleanor herself was only beginning to comprehend. When they finally departed shortly after midnight, the relief of escaping the scrutiny of society was palpable, though tempered by the weight of unspoken emotions that filled the carriage as they journeyed back to Catherine's house. Eleanor's mind raced with the implications of the evening, not merely what they had observed of Lord Whitley, which would certainly advance their investigation, but the far more personal implications of Alexander's public defence. Such a declaration of support from the Duke of Thornfield went beyond their agreed-upon narrative of professional association. It represented a social alignment that would inevitably fuel speculation about the true nature of their relationship. More unsettling than society's potential interpretation, however, was Eleanor's growing awareness of her own feelings, the undeniable truth that her admiration and respect for Alexander had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous to her peace of mind. When the carriage came to a stop before Catherine's house, Alexander descended first as always, offering his hand to assist her. As Eleanor stepped down, their eyes met in the soft glow of the carriage lanterns, and for one breathless moment, the careful distance they had maintained seemed to dissolve entirely. "Eleanor," Alexander said, using her given name for the first time, his voice carrying a note of something that made her heart beat faster. "There is something I must discuss with you. May I come inside?" The simple request, laden with unspoken significance, hung in the air between them as Eleanor nodded her assent, knowing instinctively that whatever transpired in the next few hours would irrevocably change the course of both their lives. The library of Catherine's house welcomed them with its familiar warmth, the embers in the fireplace stirred to life by Mrs. Winters before she discreetly withdrew, leaving them in a privacy that suddenly seemed charged with new significance. Alexander stood by the mantelpiece, his tall figure illuminated by the dancing firelight, his usual composure visibly strained as he gazed at Eleanor across the room. The silence between them stretched taut with unspoken emotions until Alexander finally broke it, his voice low and unexpectedly vulnerable. "What I witnessed tonight," he began, his words carefully measured yet tinged with an intensity Eleanor had never heard before, "has forced me to acknowledge certain truths that I can no longer ignore, regardless of their inconvenience." He moved away from the fireplace, crossing the space between them with deliberate steps until he stood directly before her, close enough that she could detect the subtle scent of sandalwood that clung to his evening clothes. When Lady Victoria attacked you, I experienced a clarity of feeling that has eluded me since Catherine's death. In that moment, I understood that my concern for you has transcended our shared purpose, that somewhere during these weeks of working together, of seeing your intelligence, your quiet courage, your fundamental decency, I have developed feelings that I neither anticipated nor sought, but which I can no longer deny. The confession, delivered with the same precision he brought to all matters, yet underlaid with unmistakable emotion, left Eleanor momentarily speechless, her heart thundering against her ribs as she struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what Alexander was revealing. Eleanor's silence prompted Alexander to continue, his usual confidence giving way to a rare uncertainty that rendered him suddenly, startlingly human in her eyes. I understand that this revelation may be unwelcome, that you may have viewed our association as nothing more than a necessary alliance to achieve justice for Catherine. If that is the case, I ask only that you allow me to continue supporting your security and comfort while we complete our investigation, after which you would be free to pursue whatever path you choose with my full assistance. The humility in this statement, the willingness of the powerful Duke of Thornfield to accept rejection without recrimination, moved Eleanor profoundly, revealing the true depth of his character in a way that his grand public defense had not. Finding her voice at last, Eleanor spoke with the quiet honesty that had characterized all their interactions. "Alexander," she said, the use of his given name feeling both strange and perfectly natural on her lips, "my feelings have undergone a similar transformation, though I scarcely dared acknowledge them even to myself. The difference in our stations seemed an insurmountable barrier, and I feared that expressing such sentiments would jeopardize our shared purpose or appear as though I sought advantage from our association." The admission cost her considerable effort, years of social conditioning battling against the desire for complete honesty, yet the visible effect of her words on Alexander, the sudden blazing hope that transformed his austere features, made the vulnerability worthwhile. What followed was a conversation unlike any they had shared before, intimate and honest and occasionally halting, as two people accustomed to guarding their innermost thoughts navigated the unfamiliar territory of genuine emotional disclosure. Alexander spoke of his grief following Catherine's death, how it had hardened the shell of isolation he had constructed after his wife's betrayal and tragic death years earlier. He described how Eleanor's intelligence and quiet strength had initially earned his respect during their investigation, but how her compassion and fundamental goodness had gradually penetrated defenses he had believed impenetrable. Eleanor, in turn, revealed the loneliness of her position as a companion, always present yet never truly seen, and how Alexander's willingness to value her mind and respect her perspective had awakened a sense of self-worth that years of dismissal had nearly extinguished. As they spoke, the distance between them gradually diminished, Alexander taking her hand in a gesture that felt simultaneously momentous and entirely natural. When he finally asked permission to court her properly, once their investigation concluded, to build a relationship founded on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than the conventional calculations that typically governed aristocratic matches, Eleanor's acceptance came without hesitation, her heart too full for doubt. Their newfound understanding brought with it a renewed determination to complete the investigation that had initially brought them together. With Lord Whitley's connection to Baron Blackwood confirmed by their observations at the ball, they now had a potential motive for Catherine's murder beyond mere financial gain. Baron Blackwood had been a vocal opponent of the healthcare reforms Catherine had advocated. Reforms that would have threatened the profitable but ethically questionable medical practices that had enriched physicians like Lord Whitley. Alexander proposed an audacious plan to obtain final proof of their suspicions. He would host a small dinner party the following week, ostensibly to celebrate his return to society, and would ensure that both Lord Whitley and Baron Blackwood received invitations. Eleanor would attend as his official guest, their new relationship providing the perfect cover for her presence, and together they would create an opportunity to observe the two men interacting in a more intimate setting where they might be less guarded. The strategy was not without risk, particularly given the dangerous nature of their adversaries should they realize they were under suspicion, but both Eleanor and Alexander recognized that justice for Catherine demanded courage. As the night deepened around them, their conversation gradually shifted from immediate plans to tentative visions of a shared future. Alexander speaking of his estates that had for too long lacked a compassionate mistress, Eleanor expressing her desire to use whatever position she might have to advocate for those society typically overlooked. The plans remained theoretical, contingent on the successful conclusion of their investigation, yet they carried a weight of promise that filled the library with a sense of possibility neither had dared imagine mere weeks before. When Alexander finally rose to take his leave, the hour approaching dawn, he raised Eleanor's hand to his lips in a gesture that, while entirely proper, conveyed emotions far beyond conventional courtesy. "Until tomorrow," he said softly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that needed no further words. As Eleanor watched his carriage disappear into the lightening sky from Catherine's window, she felt a profound sense of transformation, as though the young woman who had stood trembling in the defendant's box, alone and discarded by society, had finally been fully replaced by someone new, someone who had discovered her own worth reflected in the eyes of a man who saw her true self with perfect clarity. Whatever challenges awaited them, Eleanor knew with unshakable certainty that neither of them would face them alone again. The dinner party that Alexander hosted the following week represented the culmination of their carefully orchestrated plan, every element arranged with meticulous attention to create the perfect opportunity for observation and, if fortune favored them, confession. Catherine's diary had indicated that Lord Whitley had administered what he claimed were special tonics during private consultations, and Alexander had arranged for the identical crystal decanters to be prominently displayed on the sideboard, filled with various cordials and liqueurs. Eleanor, dressed in a gown of deep emerald that complemented her chestnut hair and fair complexion, moved through the gathering with newfound confidence, no longer the accused thief, but the acknowledged companion of the Duke of Thornfield. Society's elite, ever adaptive to shifts in power, treated her with cautious respect, particularly after Alexander's aunt, the Countess of Harrington, made a point of engaging Eleanor in animated conversation about Catherine's research projects. Throughout the evening, Eleanor maintained her role perfectly, dividing her attention between the assembled guests and careful observation of Lord Whitley, who appeared increasingly discomfited by the numerous references to Catherine's medical interests that Alexander had woven into the dinner conversation. The decisive moment came after the meal, when the gentlemen retired to Alexander's study for brandy, while the ladies withdrew to the drawing room. Eleanor had anticipated this separation and positioned herself near the study door on the pretext of examining a painting in the adjacent corridor. From this vantage point, she could overhear the conversation within, particularly when Alexander deliberately steered the discussion toward his sister's mysterious illness and his growing suspicion that her death had not been from natural causes. Lord Whitley's response, a nervous dismissal followed by a hasty attempt to change the subject, contrasted sharply with Baron Blackwood's cold interjection that some matters are better left unexamined, particularly when they serve the greater good. The Baron's voice dropped to a near whisper as he continued, but Eleanor caught the chilling phrase, regrettable necessity, and something about her reforms would have devastated proper medical practice. When Alexander pressed further, suggesting he had evidence that might interest the authorities, the Baron's tone turned threatening, implying that accidents befall even dukes when they meddle in affairs beyond their understanding. The naked hostility in these words sent a shiver of fear through Eleanor, not for herself but for Alexander, whose deliberate provocation had clearly struck its mark. What happened next unfolded with a swiftness that left Eleanor breathless. Alexander had anticipated the possibility of threats and had positioned his most trusted servants at strategic locations throughout the house, including 2 former soldiers from his regiment who now entered the study at a prearranged signal. The commotion that followed drew the attention of the other guests, who emerged from the drawing room to find Lord Whitley being restrained, while Baron Blackwood faced Alexander with cold fury. With commanding presence, Alexander addressed the assembled company, his voice carrying the weight of both ducal authority and personal anguish as he revealed the evidence they had compiled: Catherine's coded diary, chemical analysis of her medications showing traces of arsenic, financial records documenting payments from the Baron to Whitley coinciding with Catherine's decline. The shocked silence that greeted these revelations was broken by Lord Whitley himself, who, confronted with the weight of evidence and the prospect of bearing sole responsibility, turned on his patron with bitter recriminations that amounted to a full confession. The Baron's attempt to maintain composure crumbled as Whitley detailed specific instructions he had received, culminating in the damning statement that her death was meant to look natural, as you insisted, to prevent any investigation that might trace back to your involvement. The aftermath unfolded with the inexorable justice that Alexander and Eleanor had sought for so long. The authorities were summoned, statements taken from the stunned dinner guests who had witnessed the confrontation, and both Lord Whitley and Baron Blackwood were removed to face charges that would ultimately lead to their conviction. As the last of the guests departed, leaving Alexander and Eleanor alone in the suddenly quiet house, the full emotional impact of what they had accomplished swept over them. Catherine had been vindicated, her murderers exposed, and the corrupt system that had protected them dealt a significant blow. Yet beyond this public victory lay the more personal transformation that their journey had wrought. Standing together in the soft lamplight of Catherine's favorite reading room, Alexander took both of Eleanor's hands in his normally guarded expression open with emotion as he spoke of futures and possibilities, of partnerships that transcended conventional understanding, of the rare blessing of finding someone who truly saw and valued one's essential self. When he finally knelt before her, offering not just his name and title but his trust and his heart, Eleanor's acceptance came with the absolute certainty that they had found in each other something far more precious than justice or vindication. They had found home. 6 months later, Eleanor Blackwood, once dismissed as a mere lady's companion and falsely accused thief, stood in the ancient cathedral of St. George's as the Duchess of Thornfield, her simple but elegant wedding gown complemented by a sapphire pendant that had belonged to Catherine. The assembled guests represented a remarkable cross-section of society, from Alexander's aristocratic connections to the servants and tenants who had come to respect Eleanor during her time at Thornfield, from scholars who had collaborated with Catherine to reformers who had found in the new Duchess an unexpected and influential ally. The whispers that followed Eleanor now spoke not of scandal but of admiration for the transformation she had brought to both the Duke and his vast estates, for her quiet intelligence and genuine compassion that had begun to influence even the most entrenched social circles. As she moved through the reception on Alexander's arm, acknowledging congratulations with gracious dignity, Eleanor caught sight of Lady Victoria Pembroke watching from a distance, her expression a complex mixture of bitterness and dawning respect. The sight prompted not satisfaction, but a gentle resolution in Eleanor's heart, that her newfound position would be used not for retribution but for reform, to create a society where worth was measured by character rather than circumstance, where truth might prevail over prejudice. Dear listener, as our tale draws to its close, perhaps you will take from Eleanor's journey something beyond mere entertainment. In a world that often measures value by the most superficial metrics, by wealth or beauty or social position, remember that true worth resides in qualities less visible but infinitely more enduring, in courage that stands firm against injustice, in intelligence that seeks truth beyond convenience, in compassion that recognizes the humanity in all. Eleanor's vindication came not merely through the Duke's dramatic intervention in that courtroom, though that moment changed the course of her life, but through her own unwavering commitment to principles that transcended her circumstances. And Alexander found in her not just an ally in his quest for justice, but a mirror that reflected back the best version of himself, a companion who understood that true nobility has nothing to do with titles and everything to do with character. Perhaps in your own life you have felt underestimated or overlooked, your true gifts unseen beneath the labels society so readily assigns. Take heart from Eleanor's story, for sometimes the most powerful transformation begins when just one person truly sees us, recognizing the light that others have missed. And in that recognition, in that moment of being truly seen, we often discover strengths within ourselves that we never knew existed, capacities for growth and joy and purpose that were waiting only for the courage to claim them as our own.